Hi, my name is Andre Gonoella. Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. As many of you know, President Jimmy Carter passed away at the age of 100 on December 29th. Today is Friday, January 10th. His state funeral was just held yesterday in Washington, D.C. I was privileged enough to go and observe and pay my respects at the procession on Pennsylvania Avenue when they were transferring the president's casket onto the caisson. I was able to see the family walk behind the casket as well. And it was a very moving experience. President Carter is someone who, as a person, I personally admire, but many historians, many political commentators often will contest his presidential legacy. So to sort of dissect his presidential legacy, I have a great presidential historian joining me here today, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. She is a presidential historian and the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. By the way, if you have not visited that presidential library at Mount Vernon, please do. It's amazing. The exhibits are fantastic, and you learn a lot about our first president that you may not really know about. She is also the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, a co-editor of Mourning the President's Loss and Legacy in American Culture, and the forthcoming book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. She regularly writes for public audiences in a variety of news outlets, and she's been quite active over the last week since President Carter's passing, sharing her expertise and reflections on President Carter's legacy. And Lindsay wrote a great piece in the Bulwark, actually, that I'm going to touch on later in this interview, focusing on President Carter's redefinition of his legacy. And you make the really interesting comparison to John Quincy Adams, but we'll talk about that later. First of all, Lindsay, thanks for joining me here today. I know it's been a hectic week for you with all of the ceremony and the reflections on President Carter's legacy.
Absolutely. Happy to join you.
So, President Carter's presidential and post-presidential legacy, I feel like a lot of political commentaries have centered around this idea that President Carter is a failed, if not troubled, president, but he is the best post-president that this country has ever had. How do you make sense of that reflection? Is that an apt attribute to describe President Carter?
Well, I generally am reluctant to call someone a failed president just because they're a one-term president. And I think that is often the shorthand because I think not winning re-election is often a more accurate reflection on political skills rather than leadership skills. And those are often very different things. I also think that it's difficult in the moment to assess someone's success or failure because so many of a president's policies take a long time to actually pan out and to see if legislation was successful or a failure, to see if executive orders were successful or failure, to see if foreign policy was a success or a failure. So at the time, to be sure, I think that Carter was viewed as a failure, but I think historians have started to reassess that interpretation, and rightly so. History takes a long time to write well. You are not going to have access to all of the classified information the moment that a president leaves office. You are not going to be able to tell how those policies panned out, as I was describing. And you're not going to be able to see what happens afterwards. And that often does impact how we see a president's tenure. So I wouldn't say that Carter was a failure per se. Certainly there are things that he didn't do well, but there are also things he did do well. And that I think is pretty standard for a president. In terms of his post-presidential life, I do think he had among the best post-presidential careers. Now, partly he benefited from having the longest, which meant that he had the most time to do good and to contribute to the world. But he also took that opportunity and made the most of it by establishing the Carter Center, which helped eradicate diseases around the world, did election and democracy monitoring, advocated for human rights and civil rights. And the Carter Center really carved a new path for what post-presidents could do with their life. That was not something that was typically done. And now we see that that is much more the model.
So, how do we consider the Carter term? Because President Carter came into office, he was Jimmy the Peanut Farmer when he arrived on the national scene in 1976, coming after the dark throes of Watergate, the chaos of the 1960s, and then, of course, immediately before this sort of cinematic Reagan administration and the end of the Cold War. And President Carter is sort of neatly wedged in there for 4 years. And I certainly agree with you on your assessment of an inability to call a one-term president a failed president. I think particularly for President Carter, he was one of the most legislatively successful presidents in history, I think, for his one term. Uh, but I feel like a lot of public memory sometimes has focused in on so much of on some of these other things, like, Camp David Accords, which is a big accomplishment, the Iranian hostage crisis, which is seen as one of the big sort of flaws of his presidency, inflation, energy, etc. But how do we look at that in historical context, his one term, his 4 years?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, Carter benefited from the moment he was coming into and was failed by the moment that he was in. So I don't know that Carter would have been elected if he wasn't coming on the heels of the Watergate crisis, because so much of what made him appealing was that he appeared to be the antithesis of Richard Nixon and the corruption of Watergate. He seemed honest, he was decent, he was moral and religious, and rejected all of the trappings of Washington, D.C. in a way that people were interested in someone rejecting the trappings. And so I do think he, in some ways, benefited. And yet, the 1970s were a terrible time for the United States. The economy was in shambles.
Yeah.
Its position on the world stage was at one of its lowest moments. Allies were sort of uncomfortable and distrusting of the United States. There was a lot of international discord. And so I think there were just so many factors that even the very best presidents might have had trouble grappling with. And a lot of that moment required skills that Carter didn't have. He had a lot of really excellent attributes. Like you said, he passed so much legislation. He was very detail oriented. And sometimes that was particularly important, especially when it came to things like environmental protection. But he didn't embrace the bully pulpit of the presidency. He was not a particularly rhetorically gifted orator. And I think Americans did need a salesperson. They needed someone who could really harness the energies and the spirit of the US and provide an optimistic look. And that's what Reagan provided. And so, I just think that it was kind of a mixed bag for him in a lot of ways. And presidency should be understood as that, as a mixed bag, as both a time of really excellent accomplishment and also one of limitations. The last piece that I think is worth emphasizing is Carter was incredibly forward looking. And yesterday when we were listening to the funerals, the eulogies, and his grandson Jason called him the first millennial president. And I think it was a very funny joke. It was a very good, moment, but it was accurate. He was incredibly forward thinking when it came to environmental protections, deregulation, encouraging small businesses. He sort of defied traditional left, right, Republican, Democrat party lines on a lot of those positions. And so I do think that he was oftentimes out of step with where the nation was.
No, certainly. And I mean, you make the point, right? Like Reagan comes in afterwards. He is that optimistic cheerleader. I think there's a 1985 interview that President Carter did with Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes, where Wallace was sort of saying, Reagan's this Teflon president. He's able to avoid a lot of blame for fundamental issues in the country. And then on the opposite side, you have President Carter, who sort of takes the blame for all that's going wrong in the country in the late 1970s. And as he said, the 1970s were a very historically difficult time for the United States with a range of challenges that could challenge any, I think, U.S. president. But you make the point that, he comes onto the national scene as sort of this outsider. And I mean, for I think the duration of his political life, even well into the post-presidency, President Carter, it feels like he does not fit in to the DC establishment. He is the antithesis to, of course, President Nixon, but to so many of the DC elites. Even when you look at a photo of all the of all the presidents, the former presidents, with President Carter, I think there's a famous photo of when President Obama was about to be inaugurated, President Bush invited Bush Sr., Clinton, Obama, and President Carter to the White House. And Carter is sort of standing there off to himself, almost, as if there's just this sort of outsider tendency that persisted. It feels like he doesn't fit in, even with his criticisms of his successors, right? Like he was very critical of President Clinton over the Monica Lewinsky affair. He was very critical of President Bush over the wars in the Middle East. And I think Bush once referred to him as a thorn in his side sometimes without naming him. But how do we make sense of that outsider status, and how did it shape the way he governed?
Well, it's a complex question because the outsider status was in some ways a self-definition that Carter applied to himself because he was very political. He had served in the state legislature in Georgia, he had served as the Georgia governor, and he had run several campaigns. So it wasn't like he was a businessman that was coming into the White House and it was the first political position that he had held. It was very much a self-styling as an outsider. And then once he got to DC, his outsiderness was again by his own design. He rejected invitations to dinners at the owner of the Washington Post, Kathleen Graham, invited him to dinner several times, and he rejected those invitations. He didn't want to work with Congress. He didn't like working with Congress. He rejected a lot of the DC norms, including having a chief of staff, which really, bit him in the back because he realized he needed one and so kind of had to give way to that. But again, I think a lot of this is sort of a mentality because I think it could almost be better defined as a outsider of the traditional elite institutions. He did not go to the Ivy League. He did not come from New England. He did not come from this wealthy family. And so that was very much something he embraced as part of who he was. And to be sure that absolutely affected his ability to work with people in DC and it affected his relationships with the other presidents. I'm so glad that you mentioned that photo because it's worth looking at because there's like a distinct gap between him and the other presidents. He's standing off to the side. And maybe it was just an angle thing, but it is a very powerful visual. And I think partly that is because he did not do a lot of the things that other presidents have done after leaving office. He didn't give speeches for a lot of money. He didn't move into a fancier house. He continued to live in the same very modest home. He went to the same church. He was a part of the same community and not for lack of options. And so partly I do think it's a mentality, but it also reflects his values and what I think he believed a post president was supposed to do in terms of just being a citizen like everyone else. And as you said, that did sometimes cause friction, both because he could be outspoken in his criticism, which was something that presidents generally shy away from doing. Not always, as we've seen in recent years, but generally. But also, he took it upon himself to sometimes be a diplomat, whether or not the current president wanted his activities or
Yep.
his
North
support.
Korea.
Exactly. So this was certainly true of the Bush presidency, sorry, Bush 41 presidency. It was true of the Clinton presidency. I wonder how much of the Carter Clinton tension came from the fact that they're both Southerners and both young as presidents and both sort of heralded as a new way to be a Democrat. So I wonder if there's some personal competition there, but to be sure, there was a lot of other institutional tensions as well.
So one of the big factors leading into the Carter-Clinton tension was, I think, President Carter's attempts at diplomacy in North Korea. I think in 1994, he was the first, I think, former U.S. president or any U.S. president to visit North Korea in 1994. He met with Kim Il-sung, and I think he essentially negotiated a treaty, or he negotiated an agreement with North Korea on nuclear weapons that the Clinton administration wasn't necessarily initially a fan of. Could you dig into that, I think, example a bit more? Because I feel like that allows us to talk about his relationship with other presidents, but also his efforts at diplomacy in the post-presidency, which I think is really unique. We don't often see that with ex-presidents.
Yeah, it's very complicated because the president is mostly in charge of foreign policy. Congress has a few responsibilities, but for the most part, foreign policy is in the president's domain. And while they have subordinates who can speak on their behalf, they're really the sole representative for the nation. And that gives them a lot of personal power, which Carter used quite well in terms of the Camp David Accords. He brought the leaders of Israel and Egypt to Camp David to meet for 13 days. He personally sort of took hold of the limousines so that they couldn't leave and basically held them hostage there, and used the power of his brain and his magnetism, because apparently when you met with him in a small group, he was an incredibly compelling figure. And his, again, that attention to detail to work through some of these differences, I think because he had a lot of respect for nations' self-sovereignty, which he had demonstrated with, the Panama Canal Treaty and his treatment of Latin American nations, gave him a position of moral authority to speak from. And that set the tone for what it meant to do personal diplomacy. And other presidents since then have used the same strategies, have used Camp David, have used their power of their personality and the power of the office to try and accomplish that. That gets a lot more complicated once they leave, because once Carter left office, he was no longer in charge of foreign policy. But he did have all of this experience. He did have all of this knowledge. He had good relationships, and he had a track record that he could lean on, which gave him a lot of trust in the eyes of people that he was negotiating with. And so this is why, it was really hard for Clinton, because Carter could be a very powerful emissary as long as he was doing what Clinton wanted him to. But he didn't, because he had his own ideas about how foreign policy should be negotiated. And so, you know, other presidents have sent people on their behalf to go conduct foreign policy, and it can be quite effective if they're on the same page. In this case, Carter kind of took it upon himself without Clinton's asking. I think he did finally have permission, if I'm remembering my details correct. But Clinton was not the force behind this mission. Carter was the force behind this mission. And I can understand Clinton being frustrated by that. I think any president would, because it is supposed to be their job.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think I was watching some interviews and President Carter essentially said, I think during or before or after this sort of mission in North Korea, Vice President Al Gore called President Carter and said, "Hey, we don't really need you, in this situation." And I think he said it in a more diplomatic way, but President Carter certainly got the message. But I mean, there was a huge sort of, I think, media sort of coverage of this split between Clinton and Carter over the North Korea issue, and then they got on the same page. But I think, for our audience, like definitely look into that historical example because that's super interesting. But I want to use President Carter's relationship with former presidents as a segue because out of all the former presidents, President Carter was closest with former President Ford. And for our audience, Stephen Ford, the son of former President Ford, also a former soap opera star, might I add, I think in A Young and the Restless, gave this beautiful eulogy to President Carter that was actually written by President Ford. The story was that when President Ford was in his twilight, he had asked President Carter to deliver the eulogy, which Carter did, but Carter asked President Ford to deliver his eulogy as well. So President Ford had pre-written that, I think, in the mid 2000s. But they ran against each other in 1976. It was a pretty tough campaign. It was a pretty close campaign, and it was a sharp campaign. And that leads me to the question of what was the geopolitical context, the foreign policy context President Carter was entering, when he took office in 1977, when he ran for president in 1976. How was the world viewing the United States under the Ford administration, under the post-Nixon sort of era? What were the vibes to, put it without
Yeah.
any other, more better word?
Yeah, the vibes were really bad. And they were bad domestically because of Watergate. And even if people felt at the time that the pardon for Nixon was the right thing to do, it did really shatter Ford's approval rating, and made a lot of people really unhappy with him. Internationally, the vibes were even worse. So the US was really only about a year out from a year out from the official end of the Vietnam War, and that had been a catastrophic failure for the United States. And it appeared that the Soviet Union was on the ascent, and communism was on the march, and democracies were feckless and inefficient and couldn't really fight wars or persuade people to their point of view. The view of the United States in places like the Middle East and Latin America was also quite poor because of our tendency and our penchant for intervention and a lack of respect for sovereignty. Our relationships with people in the Middle East were quite poor as well because of oil. At that point, we relied on the import of oil for most of our energy resources, which is not the case today. We produce a lot more domestically than we bring in. And that was actually a Carter innovation. The Department of Energy was designed to both produce more energy, but also explore other methods of non-oil and coal-based energy that would be more sustainable, largely as a national security measure, recognizing that being dependent on foreign nations was a really bad idea. So Carter was coming in at a time when pretty much everything was awful.
That's a bummer. Uh, like
I know.
I would not want I would not want that situation to deal with. But I mean, sort of as you said earlier, I don't think President Carter could have been elected in a different type of situation with that sort of political circumstance. So as you said, he won and benefited from the political moment he was in and the geopolitical moment he was in, but also faced those severe limitations as a result of the political and geopolitical moment he was in. But how did the world view the Carter presidency? How did the world view Jimmy Carter as a leader, as the president of the United States? Because I mean, there's this vibe, right? Ronald Reagan, strong leader, tough as nails. Richard Nixon, strong but sort of cunning. Gerald Ford, aloof. I feel like each president has these attributes that the world can generalize about them. How did world leaders view President Carter?
Well, I think it really depends on who you're talking about. And I don't want to, speak for other nations too much. But in terms of generalizing, what's really interesting is he very quickly kind of became a cliche as a Southern simpleton. And he was a nuclear engineer. There was nothing simple about his brain. And so, depending on, if people got to the chance to meet with him, I think, he had a lot of respect from leaders in the Middle East when he was able to accomplish diplomacy. There was, I think, a lot of respect for him in some leaders in Latin America as well. I think some of our more traditional allies may have had a little bit of a raised eyebrow approach because he didn't offer the same sort of image that a lot of the other previous presidents had presented to the world. Um, and, especially when I think the Iran hostage crisis happened, it made him look a little bit uh, inept. It made him look feckless, and it made the United States look like it couldn't take care of its own. And so, certainly, that was a hit on American reputation, and I think the president's reputation more broadly.
No, yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think the big question for me, he's coming into office amidst the Cold War. Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, had dealt with multiple presidents, LBJ, Nixon, Ford. How did Brezhnev and the Soviet Union view President Carter?
So I think that was actually an example of a nation that had more respect, or at least more respect because he was difficult type of a situation. And that was in two ways. So Carter actually was able to negotiate the SALT II treaty, which limited the vehicles that brought my I will admit that my nuclear understanding and my understanding of different types of weapons is somewhat limited, but it basically limited the type of vehicles I think could carry and transport multiple nuclear warheads, if I'm remembering correctly, and tried to put impediments in place to the proliferation of new types of warheads. And so that was actually quite a productive treaty and a productive series of conversations. I think Carter also deserves a great deal of credit for the moral pressure he put on the Soviet Union. Typically,
Human rights.
yeah, exactly. Typically, Reagan gets a lot of credit for putting economic pressure with the arms race and economic pressure in general on the Soviet Union. And I think that was absolutely true. But there's no doubt that the pressure that Carter put on in terms of Afghanistan and in terms of championing human rights did make a difference. There was a great story that came out in some of the tributes in the last week that one of the Soviet dissenters that had been imprisoned for years, if not decades, when he finally was released, he was able to at one point meet with the Carters, and he showed Rosalind Carter his shoe. He had a false bottom, and in the false bottom of the shoe, he had kept a picture of Jimmy Carter as a way to try and maintain hope and a belief in human rights as a way to keep him going when he was imprisoned. That is a remarkably powerful story. And if you are a society that is trying to crack down on dissent, having an opposition leader that can inspire that type of hope is a very dangerous thing.
And in the context of the Cold War, as you said, President Reagan gets a lot of credit for the economic pressures he placed on the Soviet Union with the arms race. And I've seen some, former Carter advisors come on the media recently and say, Jimmy Carter actually paved the way for that. And I think when we sort of look back in a more generalist, historical sort of, for the general public, historically reflecting on President Carter, they sort of view Reagan and Carter as opposites in how they dealt with the Cold War. But what's the veracity of a lot of these statements coming from former Carter officials about how, perhaps President Carter may have paved the way for some of the Reagan administration's more successful approaches to the Cold War?
I think so. I mean, I think certainly um, he was in no way a Cold War dove. I don't know that we would necessarily call him a war hawk, but he was very pro-military. He had come from the military himself. He was, as I said, he was a nuclear engineer, so he had a very good understanding of the technology. He was not trying to cut defense spending. He didn't like waste, but he was very supportive of useful military spending. He was a strong advocate for Afghanistan. He was a strong moral opponent to the Soviet Union in a lot of different ways. And I think because that conversation started under Carter, it made anti-Soviet rhetoric a more bipartisan concept. We often talk about the Cold War as we say politics at the water's edge. That was absolutely a Cold War invention and really started under Truman. But because Carter had been so strongly anti-Soviet, that gave Reagan actually a lot of space to be anti-Soviet without any sort of partisan pushback. And I think because Carter, towards the end, appeared weak against Iran, that gave a lot of space to Reagan to try and be strong militarily. And sometimes the very best thing that a president can have is have a president that appears to do poorly in one section come before them, such that they can succeed in that section. And the US people, the American people, will give them a lot more leeway.
No, definitely. So President Carter's greatest achievement, at least in my view, was the Camp David Accords, because the peace between Israel and Egypt persists to this day. I mean, nearly 50 years later. And there are so many incredible stories about the personal diplomacy that Jimmy Carter deployed when he was dealing with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. And Begin was quite a difficult political leader to deal with, and I think primarily because he comes from Likud, the more right-wing Israeli political party that Bibi Netanyahu is from right now. And then Anwar Sadat, I feel like he was almost just like this great dance partner in terms of like the negotiations. But Lindsay, the Camp David Accords, how do you reflect on that as indicative of President Carter's efforts at personal diplomacy in dealing with these two leaders in a very difficult context regionally, two countries that really hated each other, but was able to just secure that peace?
There's a very, sort of childish phrase that you hear on the playground that says takes one to know one. And I think because Carter himself could be difficult, he was, we often think of him as this like Fred Rogers type grandfather figure. And he was that, but he also was deeply ambitious. I think that the a reporter, gosh, now I can't remember the name, but one of the early reporters that covered him talked about how he was a mean son of a beep and that he would chew off your arm if it meant that he could get something he wanted. And so he could be a difficult person. And so he understood difficult, ambitious politicians. And that I think actually gave him a lot of leverage when he was negotiating individually with Sadat and Begin because they were also difficult, ambitious people and came from, very principled positions. And so that personal diplomacy is so essential if you are trying to get two people who have centuries of, I don't say baggage dismissively, but centuries of hostility and background that they are contending with and deep religious conviction. Well, Jimmy Carter understands religious conviction. And so I think he, in that way, was again sort of the right person for the moment because he could handle the real challenges of that situation.
Yeah, and I mean the tensions between the Israelis and the Egyptians, I mean, certainly biblical if you read the book of Exodus, right?
Exactly. And, no one knew that biblical story better than Carter. And so, but he, I think, was in a position where he, of course, was a Christian, but he had deep reverence for the Israeli people and the land because of the biblical history. And so he was not coming, I think, at that disagreement from a place of bias and clearly was able to convey that, otherwise would not have been able to actually work with both people.
I mean, there's a famous story, I think. Negotiations are at an impasse one night. Sadat and Begin don't want to step into each other's, I think, cabins at Camp David. I think Begin's threatening to leave the next day. And I think Carter manages to figure out the names of Begin's grandkids. And I think he writes a letter to Begin's grandkids. I think almost sort of like a what if, right? An aspirational, this is what your granddad and Jimmy and Anwar were able to accomplish in securing peace. This is what we're able to secure for your generation. And I think he gave the letter to Begin. And Begin was so visibly moved that he came back to the negotiating table the next day. And I think that's a story that has really stood out to me about Camp David. But I mean, when they signed the agreement, I think Begin referred to it as the Jimmy Carter agreement at the press conference. So, I mean, while he was a difficult person to deal with, and it takes one to know one, was he an empath? I guess. I mean, it feels like he was able to put himself into these two leaders, their shoes. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he, from what I understand from people who know him or knew him much better and have studied him in much more detail than I have, basically said that from a deep religious conviction, he believed in the importance of trying to make the world a better place. And politics was a tool to do that. Diplomacy was a tool to do that. There was a duty and a burden, but also as an opportunity as a Christian and as a man of faith to make the world a better place through service. And so he did, I think, have empathy for people who were in a much worse place than he was. And that included people who lived in war-torn regions and who had been blighted by centuries of conflict. And so while he could be difficult and hard, he did have empathy for the world and he had empathy for people who were struggling and saw his duty and saw the duty of other leaders to try and prove the lot for those who were coming after them. And so I think that very much accords with that letter you were describing, where he was saying, here's what we can do to make our grandchildren's lives a better place. And isn't it worth doing that if we have the opportunity to do so?
Yeah, and in talking about his affinity for the Israeli people, he also had a lot of empathy for the Palestinian people, and certainly was an advocate, which I feel like makes him a more prominent outlier in terms of presidents in their views in the Middle East. I mean, famously in 2006, well after the presidency, he wrote "Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid," which caused quite a bit of controversy around him in sort of political circles. Was he an outlier on that issue? Was he an outlier in terms of presidents on his views on the Middle East?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Look, this subject is so fraught right now with tension because we have a whole other conflict that has been raging since
Yeah.
October 7th of 2023, and it is complicated by it is hard to describe it historically without invoking current tones and current items for debate. Certainly, the expectation has been of US presidents that they will be supportive of Israel in their efforts to stay alive and to exist in a region that is generally hostile to their existence. That has often meant that they have been less sympathetic to the Palestinians, not necessarily because of the Palestinians, but because of either the other Middle Eastern powers in the region or because of the presence of Hamas in Palestine. Carter was certainly more vocal in his sympathy and support for the Palestinians than most presidents have been. Other than that, it's kind of hard to say because we often don't know exactly what people feel internally, and rather what they're saying outwardly is usually more a product of
Yeah.
politics.
So when we talk about another country in the Middle East that President Carter had a lot of difficulties with, we reference time and time again, Iran. The Iranian hostage crisis, 444 days, the hostages were from the embassy, 52 were kept and then released minutes after Reagan was sworn in during the 1981 January inauguration. Why was that issue so difficult for President Carter to deal with? Like, why did it plague him so much?
I think it did for a couple of reasons. So the first was that what sparked a lot of the initial conflict was his decision to allow the former head of Iran into the United States for cancer treatment. And he had initially rejected those requests because that cancer treatment was allowed elsewhere, and he didn't want to give political asylum to a leader that had been deposed by the Iranian people and was probably guilty of certainly, crimes against his people, but was not a particularly favorable person. He was kind of forced into it by a number of moderate forces, in particular Nelson Rockefeller, to finally kind of allow the Shah, it was the Shah, right? Allow the Shah into the United States. Just want to make sure I get my facts right here. To allow the Shah into the United States, and so it was difficult because it wasn't something he had wanted to do anyway, and then he got blamed for it. It was made more complicated by the tenor of the moment. So the longer every single day that the hostage crisis went on, the TV stations, and at that time there were really only three TV stations. All of them had this like ticker at the bottom of the news station that would say how many days the hostage crisis was ongoing. It came on the back of the failure in Vietnam, and the very visible failure to rescue the hostages reminded people of the failure in Vietnam. And so it had a much larger message about the decline of American power, the decline of American sovereignty, the inability to be a powerful nation. And so people were taking messages about the United States position in the world far beyond the current crisis. It was also deeply devastating because there were Americans stuck in captivity, and no president wants that because anyone with, I think, an ounce of feeling would feel quite badly about Americans on their watch being held under difficult circumstances. And lastly, it was very difficult for him to get out of because Iran was personally mad at him. It wasn't just that they were mad at the United States, they were also mad at him. So the decision to release the hostages had been made before Reagan took the oath of office, and they delayed the release intentionally until into Reagan's presidency as basically an FU to Carter, as a middle finger to him intentionally. So that is very difficult to get around if you're used to trying to conduct diplomacy in a reasoned fashion.
Yeah, and I mean, Carter said that he learned that the hostages were in the air while he was still on the stand at the inauguration at the Capitol. He said it was one of the greatest moments of his life, but I mean, also like just incredibly painful, right? So,
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, another foreign policy actually issue, I think that's getting overlooked, but very prescient for today's world, our geopolitical circumstances, is the normalization with China that President Carter oversaw. I mean, of course, we see Nixon's trip to China in 1972 as being, the opening up. But I mean, President Carter was actually in office during that sort of issue, the actual implementation of that. What are some of your reflections on, I guess, that issue as part of Jimmy Carter's legacy, U.S.-China relations?
It strikes me, and I'm sort of processing this thought while we're talking about it, so it may be a little bit half-baked, but so much of Carter's foreign policy was a rejection of the tropes that had been firmly held. So he rejected the idea that we had to dominate Latin American nations or Middle Eastern nations. He was very much supportive of self-sovereignty for those nations and treating them as equals to partner with on economic issues, on trade issues. He, rejected what would have, I think, been the approach to Iran that would have had it that crisis happened 30 years earlier, we probably would have sent in the military to like the giant American military to get the hostages back. He did not have the same Cold War approach that, say, an Eisenhower or even a Kennedy had. And I think his approach to China was similar. It was a rejection of this black and white mentality of what it meant to be a member of the international community. And that meant you didn't have to disagree, you didn't have to agree with someone on all of their ideological positions. You didn't have to support everything they were doing, and you could still try and work with them in recognition of shared humanity and in the hopes that that actually might make things better.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think one issue, you mentioned Latin America, one issue that's weirdly come back up to the fore of American politics is the Panama Canal issue.
Hmm. Who
Critics,
thought that would be relevant today?
yeah, I didn't really expect it, especially to come up the week of President Carter's reflections, the ceremony, and so on. So, I mean, critics, I mean, Ronald Reagan was very critical of this. President-elect Trump is critical of it right now, I guess. They say that President Carter gave up the canal up to Panama. I mean, what was the context? I mean, like, what really happened with that whole Panama Canal issue? I mean, it was such a big issue actually back in like the late 70s and then in the 1980 election. Now, certainly faded really from public remembrance until President Trump made his comments.
Well, I will confess to not knowing all of the details of the negotiations behind the scenes, but I think that the historical context is important, and that is at the peak of American jingoism, which probably was best embodied by Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt declared in his Roosevelt Corollary that the US would interfere in Latin American affairs if countries had a history of doing things that were basically uncivilized. That's my language, but I'm summarizing. And he then backed that up by sending warships to quote unquote help the Panamanians declare independence from Colombia and to encourage them, quote unquote, encourage them to sign a treaty to give the United States, I think it's 10 square miles to create the Panama Canal. And we paid them a certain amount of money, and there was going to be an annual lease for it. Now, I don't mean to suggest, I actually love Theodore Roosevelt. He's one of my favorite presidents. I think the Panama Canal is a genius creation. It has facilitated international trade and made a lot of really incredible innovations possible. But there obviously is a lack of self-sovereignty for the Panamanians to kind of force our way into that agreement. And by the 1970s, as a lot of Latin American nations were trying to assert themselves as fully independent nations, that issue had very much come to the fore. This was, of course, after Egypt had done the same thing with the Suez Canal after World War II. And so it was very much a debated issue because the United States had paid for it, had built it, had managed it. We wanted to continue to have good terms because it is an essential part of our trade and lifeblood. It is an essential part of how the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States can get goods back and forth. Not everything goes over land. In fact, a lot of times it's easier and cheaper for it to go on ship and to go through the Panama Canal. And so it was essential to our economy that it continue to operate in a way that was favorable to us. And there was a recognition that a lot of Latin American nations were not favorable to the United States at the time, sometimes because of communist sympathies, sometimes because we didn't have a great track record and there wasn't a whole lot of trust. There were lots of different factors, sometimes because of how American businesses had operated, et cetera, et cetera. And so the argument was if you give over control of this very important element of our economy, you're risking it being taken over by hostile forces. And what's interesting about the way that Carter resolved it, and I think I learned this the other day. I think I was listening to Jonathan Alter talk about this, but that he called Reagan and told him he was going to sign the treaty. And he didn't have to because, Reagan wasn't the president. He wasn't the president-elect, but it was considered the right thing to do. And that's how politics operated at the time. And Reagan, was disagreed with the policy, but, basically said, of course he would call me and tell me. And Reagan did the same thing when he was president, and it was clear there was going to be a Democratic candidate as well. So it's a little bit of a difference of our politics then and now. Um, you know, we have obviously continued to use the Panama Canal. Our economy is doing just fine. We are still the most powerful economy in the world. So some of those fears did not come to pass. I did not ever expect it to be a subject of politics in 2025.
Yeah, absolutely. In our last few minutes, I mentioned your article in the Bulwark, which I'll be linking in the description for this episode. But President Carter, as you argue, was successful in redefining his overall legacy through his post-presidency. Herbert Hoover, the president who was marked by the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933, had, I think, a 31-year retirement and did so much incredible work, particularly around World War II, reminiscent of his work during World War I, and was seen as a respected elder statesman, but was never able to shake off that Depression legacy. It appears that Jimmy Carter has been able to sort of shake off a bit about that legacy because so much of our commentary about him is humanitarian, Nobel Peace Prize winner. And I feel like, to some extent, George W. Bush is trying the Jimmy Carter and perhaps the Herbert Hoover approach with some of his work with the Bush Foundation, but I think it's a little bit less successful given the recency of President Bush and all of the chaos that, is still very much percolating today. But you compare President Carter's success to the success of John Quincy Adams from nearly 200 years ago. Can you tell our audience a bit more about that comparison?
Absolutely. So John Quincy Adams was, I think, one of the all-time great secretaries of state. He had started his diplomatic career when he was 12, serving as his father's secretary, John Adams, when they went to Europe during the Revolutionary War. He had a number of different diplomatic positions. He served in the Senate. He was then Secretary of State, and then he was president. And his presidency was one term, just like Jimmy Carter. It was a mixed bag. I think he is a little bit underappreciated as well, but nonetheless, it was a mixed bag. He was defeated by Andrew Jackson and then went home, but he was used to action and activity, and his constituents sent him back to the House of Representatives. And he had an extraordinary career in the House of Representatives, largely serving as a thorn in the side of the slave power in the South. He was a vocal opponent of slavery. He was a vocal opponent, in particular, of the gag rule, which prevented people from talking about it in Congress.
Forward thinking.
He is, or it's very true. He served as the counsel for the enslaved individuals that had been captured on the Amistad and secured their release, and actually died in the Capitol building. He had a stroke when he was in the building and died in the Speaker's office, and is largely, I think, remembered for both his activities before and after his presidency. which it was not. What was unusual about him was that he had such a long post-presidential life. Most presidents at the time didn't, just because of the vagaries of 18th and 19th century healthcare, and death was quite unpredictable from time to time. But most presidents since then still haven't had that lengthy post-presidential life, but tend to go home and be quiet. They tend to not do a whole lot. In the 20th century, there has been an expectation, especially as things like publishing books and speaking fees have made most post presidents quite wealthy, that they will participate in humanitarian activities. But certainly no one has done so on the scale of Jimmy Carter. And where Jimmy Carter differs from people like Hoover, as you gave an example, or even Nixon, is people who were not alive during his presidency don't talk about his presidency. They talk about what he did afterwards. People who were not alive during Nixon's presidency talk about Watergate. People who were not alive during Hoover's presidency talk about the Great Depression. And so, to be sure, I don't think Carter's presidency had such extreme negatives that he had to overcome. He didn't have the greatest depression in American history. He didn't have the greatest scandal until recently in American history, but he did have a lot of negatives. And so the ability to reframe how he is viewed in American life took decades of dedication, of public service, of humanitarian effort, of really incredible international travel, the full use of his position and power and prestige as a former president. I don't think he was doing it to rewrite his legacy per se, but I do think he accomplished it.
Absolutely. And what you say is very true. A lot of young people know him for the post-presidency, and that's why a lot of young people were out there in the frigid DC cold air just this past week, waiting hours and hours and hours to pay their respects at the Capitol building for President Carter. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining me here today. This was a great discussion on President Carter's legacy, his foreign policy legacy, particularly, and for our audience. If you want to learn more about John Quincy Adams, his dad, you can check out Lindsay's book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. And also, as we think about presidential legacies with President's Day coming up and, the ceremonies and the observances around President Carter's passing, Lindsay was a co-editor on Mourning the President's Loss and Legacy in American Culture. And of course, if you're in the DC area, please check out Mount Vernon. Lindsay is the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. It's a very engaging and accessible place to learn about the legacy of our first president. Lindsay, thanks again for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.